Well, thank you for coming, and I'm so glad to see you here because I did think with this title that I just might be talking to a chair and a friend. So thank you so much for coming. You're probably wondering, why on earth did Julie choose such an unexciting title? And the reason I chose it is because I am seeing a lot of activity from the regulator on boards that aren't living up to standards that they have not yet measured themselves against. And there's nothing quite like measuring yourself against a challenge and knowing that you can beat it, for giving you the confidence to make the tough decisions that you have to make and thereby ensure that your organizations have the success and have the impact that you want them to have. Does that make sense? So let's get a feel for who's in the room. Who was here yesterday for CEO Day? Excellent. Great day from what I hear. And who are the executives in the audience? Same people? And the rest of you, you're all company directors? Yep. And who's not going to wave at me no matter what I ask and what they are? Thank you, sir. I respect your decision. And who was here 2 years ago? You remember the case study of the sports board that went into insolvency and came out the other side? And I left you with, they're waiting to see if they get readmitted to the league. They got readmitted to the league, and they're doing okay. They didn't win. It's not fairy tale, but they're doing okay. So just thought I'd close that loop and give you that feedback. Good. There's nothing worse than seeing a good not-for-profit fail, is there? And there's nothing better than seeing one almost fail and pick itself back up and carry on. So that's what we're going to try and do today. So I thought I'd start with a couple of questions. And you're a bit spread out. You're not around tables like you were last time. So just with the people next to you, why does your board evaluate performance? And do you evaluate the whole board? Individual directors as well as the whole board? And do you report on those evaluations to external stakeholders? Just quick chat. Obviously there's some different experiences because I can hear people saying, oh yes, but we do this. Oh, and we have done that. So really important, if what you're doing is working, keep doing it. If what you're doing isn't working, try something else. If you've got a pretty good board, can you prove it? Because what I'm seeing is a lot more people are getting a lot more interested in what goes on in the boardroom. The Americans, bless them, are already starting to ask questions about individual director voting patterns. Now, we have a much more consensus-based legislation than they do, but they do tend to drive fashion. I prefer to look at the UK model. And in the UK, there's a gentleman by the name of Professor Bob Garrett from the London School of Economics, School of Governance, and he came up with 5 key fundamental things. And he said, if you've got a good board, as you believe you do, this is probably what they're doing. First of all, they really see their duty to the company, not to each other, not to the CEO, not to anyone who might have nominated them, but to the company as a separate legal entity. They respect their own collegiality and confidentiality and their collective responsibility. I don't particularly like Bob Garrett's phrasing here that the chairman is the boss of the board, because it's a very strange environment where you get to choose your own boss And if you discover you made the wrong choice, you unchoose and choose someone else instead, which is what the legislation says. A lot of boards don't quite operate like that because of the social dynamics, but the chairman should run the board and the CEO should run the day-to-day operations, and that leaves you a beautifully nuanced grey area around the strategic operation, where I believe the two should collaborate. And then the bit that we're going to talk about today, which is that the board must develop effective annual selection, induction, evaluation, development and renewal processes to keep itself healthy and sufficiently diverse. And that, for me, is why we do board evaluations. It's all about making sure that the board is able to add the value. And then you've got to learn how to connect the board to the organisation so that you don't wind up in a situation where you're reliant on one or two people to give you all of your information. Yeah, the previous speaker talked about some of the disasters of the past, and in particular the AWB, where Trevor Pfluger, who was the chairman, was actually sentenced in 2017, and one of the things they found was that he did not make independent, specific and diligent inquiry into the assurances that the CEO gave to him and that he then gave to the board. So it's all about making sure that you have the ammunition you need to ask the questions you need to ask. And to know what you need to know, how do I stack up against the standards? And I'm seeing the ACNC, does anyone here read the ACNC compliance report every year? Yay! Some other people who don't have a work-life balance. Yes! But have you noticed how they're getting more and more active and more engaged with boards to try to raise those standards? So the aim of this is to give you the ammunition you need so that you can raise the standards yourself, so when they come around and measure you up, you go, yep, passed. We're good, thanks. And the ACNC standards are only one in a whole hierarchy of duties. So we'll talk a little bit about using them to measure your performance, but then what we will do is we will look at some of the issues around the other standards that you have to meet, and particularly the last one, because society is always ahead of the law. We decide as citizens that we're not happy with something, we make representations, we talk about it, we agitate. The politicians eventually listen, they make laws, the laws get enacted, then somebody tries a prosecution under them, and then we find out how they work in practice. And very often, the law is about 15 years behind society. So really important to think about that fiduciary obligation. Also important to think that the ACNC as a regulator is not there to try to crush not-for-profit directors. Their first step is education and support. Once you've been educated and supported, they will then move on into what they call assisted compliance, compliance investigations, sanctions, which are like injunctions, and then revocation of license. They also still have the power to dismiss boards and directors if they believe they are not suitable persons for the responsible positions. So we talked a little bit about the need to meet the standards. Is everyone here familiar with the 5 standards? Because I've already confused you with the 5 fundamentals from Bob Garrett. When you start to then add in the 10 AICD not-for-profit governance principles, sections 180 to 186 of the Corporations Act, the Workplace Health and Safety legislation, and all the other stuff, it's easy to start getting confused. But basically the standards are fairly simple. And what they say is that you need to have attention to these 5 things, and you need to be able to prove that you meet them. So back to your conversation buddies. Have a little chat. How does your board prove that you are meeting those things? How do you evaluate your board and your directors against them? And what do you do for training where you find that there's a performance gap? And I'll go back to those things for you, just so that you've got a crib sheet up here. Way to go, have a little chat. It's a little bit hard because this room is not terribly well designed for feedback, but what are some of the things that your boards are doing to prove that you meet those 5 standards? Mandatory training. So sitting people down and making sure that they're aware of the standards and that they know what they've got to do. Hopefully before you ever start measuring them against it. What else?
Selection processes.
Yep, selection processes. Yeah, I was a little at odds with the former presenter. I really think you need to be looking at these things long before induction. You need to be talking to people about this before they have joined the board so that they know and are prepared and possibly even trained. We had a hand at the back. You're going to have to shout a little loud.
I think it was me. Board evaluation questionnaires and surveys.
Dear to my heart, but yes, board evaluation. The surest way to know that you meet a certain standard is to measure yourself against it. And it doesn't matter whether that's running the 4-minute mile, which, trust me, I cannot do, or whether that's getting my boards in the not-for-profit sector to comply with the ACNC Governance Standards. I always like to do a test measure. I was the kid at school that always did the trial exams before the real ones. Yeah, if I was going to answer wrong, kind of want to know early and before anybody else knew. So here are some responses to a question that I did about the diligence of board members. And the first thing I asked was, do you personally make diligent inquiry into your legal compliance? And all of the board members either strongly agreed or slightly agreed. Then later on I asked them, do all the directors make diligent inquiry into your legal compliance? Well, even some of the ones that had strongly agreed before still strongly agreed. Some of them were still, yeah, I guess so, most of the time. But some disagreed, and a quarter of this board very strongly disagreed. What does that tell you about the board? Have a chat to your buddies. What does that tell you about the board? Okay, let's get some feedback. What were some of the things that told you about this board?
Not much communication.
Not very good communication. The skill mix was definitely a bit rough. And the frightening thing is, it was the less skilled members who thought that they were being diligent, and the more skilled members who only slightly agreed that they were being diligent, because already they were feeling that their own performance was somehow hampered by the others. When you asked them about all the directors, boom! For those of you who are old enough, that's a Monty Python record. Boom! This was a dead board waiting to be admired for its beautiful plumage. And if you're too young to get that joke, ask somebody slightly older. We know. You know. Good. Another one. We asked the same board. I understand the duty of the board to the members of my not-for-profit association. again, oh yes, we all understand. But then when you ask them, does everybody in the room understand? You had the same pattern happening. And a quarter of them said, no, I have colleagues who really do not understand their duty to members. They're well-intentioned, they're honest, they're lovely people, but they really don't understand what this board is here to do. Knowing this and having this evidence allowed that chair to have very difficult conversations with very nice people about what they needed to do, what they needed to learn, and how they could really contribute, or whether they might wish to just be volunteers in some other sense. And of the 4 that were at issue, 2 shaped up and did some director development, and 2 decided that actually they'd just like to volunteer in running operations, which is a fantastic outcome because they're happy, they're not at risk, the organisation has now got a higher performing board, and they've been able to increase the diversity of the board by bringing on other directors who have already signed up in their director appointment, which they've accepted, that they will reach these standards, that they understand what these standards are, and they commit to being diligent. So I think that's a pretty good outcome. And this all happened long before the ACNC would even have sniffed anything, because most organisations have really good managers who file the papers, who do the best they can to overcome any shortcomings that they might have from the boardroom. And my guess is that most of you would meet that description. You've got good, diligent managers who do whatever they can to make the organisation succeed. So really important. One of the things with conducting reviews, and you could see it there in some of those answers, is the really good directors give you accurate feedback on what is really happening, what is done, not what they think should be done. There is nothing more dangerous than directors who give incorrect answers in board reviews. Because when an external party comes and holds you up to account, you might find that some of the things you believed weren't actually believable. And we all know the reasonable person test. A director's belief is reasonable unless it is one that no reasonable person would ever hold. And the reason you want to check is because sometimes your policies and what's really going on are quite different. Warren Buffett said, in every company, there are people right now doing the wrong thing. The good companies find them and fix them. Words fail me on that one. So quite important, there are a lot of things you really have to decide if you are going to get value out of a review. Because it's one thing to just say, oh yes, you know, here's the standards, review us against these. But what's the scope of the review? Really think about, do I want to keep this tight amongst a group of people who have trust and loyalty and respect? So maybe just review the board. Do I want to review the collective? Do I want to review in the individuals? Do I want to do a 360, a 180, which to my mind is the board and the few senior executives? Or do I want to go wider than that and start involving stakeholders? And if so, donors, community members, beneficiaries, Government? Who do I want to involve? Who is going to give me good feedback based on real experience? How often are you going to review? You don't want to give your directors review fatigue. Yeah, it is not fair when people are volunteering if you are constantly critiquing. Not fair at all. And then you want to think about, well, what's the methodology that's going to give me the insights I need? Do I want to do a survey? Do I want to do a desk review of my governance documentation and my paper trails? Do I want to do interviews? Do I want to do a workshop where the directors can talk about the issues as they arise? Do I want to do the review myself in-house using only our own resources, or do I want to bring in an outside party? And these are all decisions that you need to have thought about before you ever come and talk to somebody like me and ask me if I'll do a review for you. And then you need to think, what am I going to use this review for? Is it a subtle way of moving a couple of directors on? Is it a subtle way of telling a few directors that I'd like them to learn a little bit more about accounting, or operations, or health and safety, or good discussion dynamics? Because some people think they're contributing when actually what they're doing is completely ruling out everybody else's contributions. That's okay. They learn. If that's what you want to do, if you're prepared to invest in their learning. Make sense? So let's have a look at some of the standards, and let's have a little conversation about, well, what would you measure or investigate to make sure that you really were complying? So if we look at the first one, how would you demonstrate that you're set up as a not-for-profit organisation operating for a charitable purpose? Constitution, I heard over here. Yep, that'll tell you that you're a not-for-profit. That's how you've been constituted. What will tell you that you're operating for a charitable purpose? Your return. What else? You can operate for a charitable purpose and still make a good, healthy profit. Yep, you can see what you're spending money on. And is that money aligned with the purpose in my constitution? Yep, I'm going to repeat what you said because the acoustics might not have put that out. Director expenses have come under the spotlight for directors in a lot of national organisations because people have felt that what they were spending the money on or what they were getting in return for their service was inappropriate. So looking at money out, how about looking at money in? Did anybody follow a recent court case about whether or not publishing religious texts was a for-profit business or a charitable purpose? So really having a look and saying, well, where is the money coming from? Are the things that people are giving me money really aligned to that purpose? And if they're not, are they small enough that they will be considered by an independent regulator who will only ask questions if there's been a complaint, that an independent regulator is going to look at them and say, no, that's just incidental, that's okay. And these are questions you don't have to be an accountant to ask. Where does our money come from? Where does it go to? How do you know that you're providing information about your purpose to the public? Your AGM. Really good thing. How many of you know that the date of your AGM is on your website and that it makes it look as if you'd be reasonably happy if people turned up? Good. Glad we got a few hands up there. So quite important. These are simple little checks. But when somebody comes looking and says, well, There's no opportunity for your members to interact with you, to talk to you, to ask questions, to raise concerns. There's not enough information about what you're doing. There's not enough information about where you're spending money, where you're getting it from. Yeah, and it's not rocket science. It's simple. But quite a few of the clients that I do board reviews for, when we look at their website, oh, it's not there. That's funny, the Constitution used to be there, but then we had the website redone and it looks so much nicer. It's just legally not compliant. Let's have a look at Standard 2, taking reasonable steps to be accountable. If you've done everything you need to do under Standard 1, the chances are that you are probably meeting Standard 2. Standard 3. This is what the questions that we looked at before were designed to provide information about, the legal compliance. How do you know that your charity isn't breaching any rules or regulations or laws? Policies. And yep, the absolute bottom line is that every policy should comply with the law. Yep. Who here has an external auditor? Excellent. Really important. Ask them. Do external auditors always get it right? Who did the board of Centro ask? Oops. Yep, the government might give funding things. Dr. Google is a source of really good advice. If you're not sure, Google it. That is independent. If it's about something that's in your board papers, it's specific. And if you've done it yourself, in your own spare time, that'll probably meet the diligent standard. So you're all way better than the directors of Centro. Has anyone here heard of a company called Feltex? What did Feltex do different to what Centro did? They asked. Their minutes showed that the directors specifically asked, what about this? What about that? Can you explain? We think we know that something's changed and yet our accounts are the same. And the court, even though they had exactly the same problem as Centro and the company became insolvent, the courts found that that board was diligent and did their duty. They were just wrongly advised by their accountants. Now, it's still a pretty sad outcome, and if they'd had a better accountant and a more attentive one, they just might have had a better outcome. So really important. Think it through. Really question. Who here's up with AASB 15? Does anyone here know what it's all about? No? Leases, revenue recognition. Whether you can book it as revenue or whether it has to go onto your balance sheet as a provision instead. So these are things that can make your accounts look like you are losing money when actually you are not. And they're technical and they're specific. So it really involves having a look at that boring bit at the back of the accounts where it says, what's changed? And then specifically asking, if these things have changed, where in the accounts are the changes from last year that reflect these changes in standard? Takes about 4 minutes. So really thinking through. Governance Standard 4. Making sure that everyone on your board has not already been disqualified. That's like making sure that every driver you have hasn't already been banned from driving. Good idea to ask them this. So quite important. If you look at Section 5 or Standard 5, the duties look surprisingly similar to the ones that you will find in the Corporations Act. Thank goodness. But really important, the ACNC says that the responsible persons should act with standards of integrity and common sense. Common sense does not figure in the Corporations Act anywhere. So I'm kind of glad that you guys are held to a higher standard. Most of the NFPs that I know run into trouble on standards 4 and 5. And it's usually because they have not either educated or trained, or they have not gathered the information, so they don't have it handy when the regulator comes and asks for it. And it's kind of important to remember that you are actually at risk. What you don't know can hurt you. You do need to call out whenever you have any issues. You also need to think about the fact that the ACNC will say that you all know that you are under the Corporations Act as well as under their act, because it's there on their website and it's there on the ASIC website. And the scary thing is that a lot of ASIC's enforcement is on people who are in small or not-for-profit businesses, possibly because they want to get their statistics for success up. And you are a good deal easier to prosecute than a big bank. Now, I've talked so far about using the ACNC standards as the basis for your evaluation, because I really think that's a good idea for a couple of years until we've really got familiar with them and clear them Olympically. However, they are not the be-all and end-all. They don't mention director effectiveness once. They don't mention strategy. They don't mention risk management or risk oversight. And I would really like to see those standards have some aspect of performance, because most of us joined our boards to help them perform rather than just to tick a box on compliance. And the other thing is they don't benchmark against other organizations. And I use the word benchmarking with caution, because if you're not careful, it will spread mediocrity. But if you're careful, it will spread best practice. Clear on the distinction? So really important, as well as using the ACNC, I would suggest have a look at yourselves against something like the CAVA policy governance model, which was specifically designed for not-for-profits and really starts with the strategic plan, the relationship with the CEOs and the executives, and looks at your delegations and your governance processes. It's a really good model for you guys to use. Think about the behaviors in your boardroom. Yeah. A good review is just to say, who asks a lot of questions? And when they ask a lot of questions, do other directors go, oh, I wish I'd asked that, because I needed to know that too. And I'd just like to leave you with a couple of slightly worrying trends. Now, these are trends from the for-profit sector, and they are global. But the PwC Annual Corporate Directors Survey showed that 45% of directors think someone on their board should be replaced. 5% think 3 or more people on their board should be replaced. 16 say 2 or more, and 24 say 1 or more. That's 45%. Which PwC said was good because it was down 1% from last year when it was 46. And almost half of the directors had negative feedback about their peers. You don't want to wait until PwC put you in a survey. You want to find this stuff and fix it yourselves. Specific concerns, and try not to nod if you have these. But 18% of directors complained that their colleagues overstepped the boundaries of the director role. 16 said they were reluctant to challenge management. 14% said their interaction style negatively impacted boardroom dynamics. 12% said they lacked appropriate skills or expertise, and 10% advanced age has diminished their performance. It is not kind to leave somebody who is not able to perform in a position of risk, and boards are risky places. The NACD found that for successful evaluations, it's important to make your directors want to be evaluated. So this is a really good conversation to have. What would make us want to volunteer to be evaluated? And usually it will be in your organizations because we want to be more effective, we want to be more successful. We want to make sure that we hit our strategic goals. What else? A few other things. Really important if you're conducting reviews, get the human elements right. Be kind to people. Respect the fact that they are donating, that they are working for you, that they are supporting the cause. Don't have people feeling like this when they come in to evaluate your board. Have them feeling like I'm being welcomed in because I'm helping, because you want to do better.
Thank you very much.